So after the DSM-3 came out, what's the story then? So because it was a great,
So that's
it was a huge leap forward.
Yeah. So the story, first of all, is that is peddled to us is that DSM-1 and DSM-2 weren't good scientific manuals, but DSM-3 is, precisely because it adopts a disease model of classification. That's the first thing. Then the second part of the story is we are finding out these are due to chemical imbalances, okay? And we begin hearing that in the 1980s quite a bit. Depression is due to low serotonin. Now, here right away you can see that what is happening is psychiatry as an institution isn't being a reliable narrator of its own science. So, for example, as early as 1983, I think it was, the NIMH conducted an investigation. Do people with depression have low serotonin prior to going on the drugs and an antidepressant? And they didn't find evidence for it to be so. Now, there were many more such trials, and here's where we'll really get into the trials, investigations, let's say, of the low serotonin theory of depression. And in 1998, the American Psychiatric Association's own textbook said, we've looked into what was called the monoamine hypothesis for depression. We've investigated it in all these ways, and we just haven't found it to be so. So within their own field, their own research field, they declared the low serotonin theory of depression dead in 1998. A few years later, and then in 2002, I think it was 2002 or 2000, there was even another textbook said, again, we've looked into the monoamine hypothesis, and we haven't found it to be so. It is not real. 2005, there was a guy named Kenneth Kendler, who was a big, world-famous guy into this whole chemical imbalance theory, and says, we have looked into this question of chemical imbalances for a wide range of disorders, and we have not found them. So among themselves, there was this sort of acknowledgement that the chemical imbalance theory hadn't panned out. But what was the public told? The public was told that it was panning out, right? Now, the reason they were told that is because that served the disease model they were trying to sell to the public. And by the way, the drug companies loved it because, of course, it became a reason to take the drug and stay on the drug. And that's one final thing here about the chemical imbalance thing, because what we're doing here right now is talking about the different aspects of this narrative. First of all, we have the DSM presented to us as this is a classification of diseases. That's not true. Then next we have the story that, we're finding out that depression is due to, major disorders are due to chemical imbalances. And then we get the third part, that drugs like Prozac, the SSRIs, and the new anti-psychotics, they fix those chemical imbalances like insulin for diabetes. Now, that's the complete story of a great medical advance, okay? So, in the 80s and 90s, they weren't finding the chemical imbalance theory pan out. Now, how about the data on the drugs themselves? There's two parts to this. In clinical trials, say of the SSRIs, they often failed to beat placebo, like Prozac. And then what would happen is the drug company might run enough trials, they'd finally get two that were positive. But so many of the trials were, in fact, they weren't even better than placebo. And these are in trials where the placebo group is composed of people who've been washed out of their antidepressant. This isn't even drug-naive people. And yet, what do we hear in the media? Oh, Prozac is a wonder drug. It can make you feel better than well. Now, that's not a claim that's a reflection of what's in the research literature. That's a claim to help sell these drugs. And then there's a final part of this whole, there's two other parts of this whole story. But what you can see is here, you can see one narrative we were told to the public. That's a narrative of great medical progress, and we all believed it. And it's going to lead to a great expansion of the psychiatric enterprise, great expansion of the use of drugs. And then we have the science story. The science story is these classifications are constructs. They're not diseases that exist in nature. That's number one. Two, the chemical imbalance theory never panned out. And by the way, the chemical imbalance theory, its roots were not based on discoveries in people. Its roots were when they learned how drugs acted on the brain. So let's say antidepressants up serotonergic activity, they hypothesized depression was due to low serotonin, but then they had to see if that was true, and they did not find it to be so. Then the third part is, these drugs really aren't that effective. They're no better than the old ones over the short term in reducing symptoms. Okay. So it's really falling apart. Then the next part is this. They start seeing a lot of chronicity appear. They see greater chronicity in psychotic patients. They're more likely to remain psychotic. They see it in depression. And now researchers go, what is going on? And in the late 70s, early 1980s, they came up with a hypothesis, a theory about what's going on. The theory was this. Say, for example, with antidepressants, what they do is they block the normal reuptake of serotonin from that synaptic cleft, that gap between neurons in the brain, right? So serotonin stays longer in that gap, and it's an excitatory neurotransmitter. It ups serotonergic activity. Well, what does your brain do? Well, your brain, because it's such a sensitive organ with all these feedback loops, it tries to compensate for this, quote, perturbation of normal functioning. And what it does when you take an antidepressant, now it dials down its own serotonergic machinery. By dialing down, it'll put out less serotonin. That's number one. That's the presynaptic neurons. And then the neurons that receive that message, the postsynaptic neurons, will dial down the density of their receptors. So the irony was, you didn't have a chemical imbalance in your brain before you went on an SSRI, but afterwards you do, and you have the very abnormality hypothesized to cause depression in the first place. Now, this sounds completely wild, but that's exactly what is in
Robert,
a
just to interject. You're saying then that the drugs that are, so we're told then that antidepressants correct this imbalance. But actually what they do is they cause the very problem that they're set out to rectify.
Exactly. And by the way, this really started to become known in the late 1970s related to antipsychotics, so we can get into that story. But it also they began to worry about it with the antidepressants, because all of a sudden depression is running a more chronic course. And in 1996, what I'm trying to talk about here is how in the scientific literature, there's a very totally different narrative from what's told to the public, okay? In 1996, Stephen Hyman, who was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States. So this is a leading figure internationally in research, right? In mental health research. He writes a paper called A Paradigm for Understanding Psychotropic Drugs. And here's what he says. All these drugs perturb normal transmission of neurotransmitters. In response to that perturbation, the brain goes through compensatory adaptations, what I just told you about. It does so trying to maintain what is known as an homeostatic equilibrium, which is normal functioning. And he concludes, at the end of this process, the brain is now operating in a manner that is both qualitatively and quantitatively different from normal. So our head researcher in the United States in 1996, in a paper to describe how psychiatric drugs work, describes how they cause your brain to operate in a manner and physiologically to be in a manner that is different than normal. Patients are being told these are normalizing drugs. The research is saying is they're abnormalizing drugs and actually creating the very abnormality hypothesized to cause these disorders in the first place.